Today is February 5th, 2021, and today we're going to be returning to a topic that I mentioned at the end of my first vlog here when I talked about focusing on Jesus' reputation and not your own, and that is the humility of God. And this is something that I really wish Christians would talk about more, because it's something that really transformed my whole perspective on who God is. And I first discovered this, I would say, when I was really more into theology rather than biblical studies, studying the Bible, because there's a difference between those two fields, but I can talk about that another time. The point is that within theology, there's a lot of great books out there, a lot of great teachings. One of them is a book called Desiring God. It's by John Piper, who I mentioned yesterday. He's a great teacher and pastor. But John Piper, he talks about how God is all about His glory. And at the end of the day, that's the priority for God, and it should be the priority for us. It's all about God's glory. And there's truth in that. That's absolutely true. I mean, we're not here for ourselves. We're here for God. But the problem with some of the emphasis on this sometimes is that it gets twisted and it begins to paint a dark and inaccurate picture of God when it is overemphasized, and when other things that are also in the Bible about who God is aren't also focused on. And so what do I mean? Well, another guy named David Platt, he wrote a book called, oh man, I think it was called Radical. This was a long time ago. I'm talking like I found this book in 2011. But anyway, in Radical, he has like a section where he talks about selfless service for a selfish God. And he's talking about the God of the Bible. And he's basically calling the God of the Bible selfish. And to connect it all, what that basically means is that God is prideful. If you're calling God selfish, because what it means as humans that we're selfish, it means that we're prideful. We're all about us. We prioritize ourselves above all others, and we don't really care what anybody else thinks. That's human nature. That's sin nature, is selfishness. That's not who God is. It's just not. And it's really all over the Bible. That's not who He is. Yes, God, for our benefit, prioritizes His will and His agenda. But that's because from the very beginning, even in the act of creating us, it was about humbling Himself, God. And anyway, I'm very passionate about this subject because it's the difference between what I believe is a false view of God and a true view of who God is. Yes, it's all about God. Yes, we're here for God. We're not here for ourselves. And we need to accept that and realize that and be humbled by that. But at the same time, there's another picture of who God is. God is not selfish. This does not make God selfish because these things are true. It's actually part of Him being humble. So let's now get into the verses I want to talk about with this. So I didn't mention, I mentioned in the previous vlog, I said how David says to God, your gentleness, and in Hebrew that's the word humility, or a coming down, humbling, makes me great. David said, your gentleness, your humility, God, makes me great. And this is in the Bible twice. Originally, it was written in 2 Samuel 22:36. And the word there for gentleness is actually a verb. So it's an act. It's an act of either getting low, so God getting low, coming down. And that would make sense because in the passage, and it's a parallel passage, so it's kind of it's the same words pretty much with some slight variances in 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18. But in the passage, basically, David is praising God for coming down out of heaven, breaking through the heavens and coming down to David's level and helping David in his times of need and giving him the strength and teaching him everything he needs to know to succeed, and God coming down like a father, like a parent would for their child, and doing these things for David. And then he says, your gentleness makes me great. And so this idea of God getting low, coming down, humbling himself, as a parent would, bowing down to get on the child's level, to get eye to eye. You have to bend down as an adult to talk to a child eye to eye, which is what God is doing and what David is talking about here. But so it's a verb here, but it can also mean it's connected to another verb that means to give an answer. So in other words, David cries out to God with questions or with asking for help, and God answers him. And that answering is also an act of God humbling himself. And so then it parallels over in Psalm 18:35, where it also says, your gentleness makes me great. But here, it's not a verb, that word in Hebrew. It's connected. It's a connected word. It's a similar word, but it's a different word. And here, it's not a verb, it's a noun. So this is now a quality. So here we see God has the quality of humility toward David. And so in God humbling himself to have a relationship with David and to come down. And so with that, now I want to read two more scriptures that just prove that God is humble. He's not prideful. He is not selfish. God is selfless. He is humble. And it's very important that we know that, to have an accurate understanding of who he is. So first we have Isaiah 57:15. And this is a great verse for recognizing God's glory as well, because it's important that we recognize his glory, that he is the name above all names, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. There's no one better than him. No one has full sovereignty or power like he does. All that is true. But also, he is humble. He does not seek selfish gain. See, that's what the devil does. That's what we do in sin nature. That's not what God does. So, it says here, for thus says the high and exalted one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. So that's God. This is God speaking. He says, I dwell in a high and holy place, right? Above and beyond all of us, even above the angels and every other heavenly being. God is above us all. I dwell in a high and holy place, yet also with a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite. Now, contrite means shattered in pieces. In Hebrew, it's like talking about a heart that is just so broken that it's like in pieces, like ground down to powder. It's so broken. So God dwells not only in the highest high, but with the lowest low. And that's why humility is so important to him, that we're humble, because if we're not humble, we're going to be disconnected from him and who he is and where his heart is. Now, this is all over the Bible, guys. Like, this should not be difficult to understand. From the very beginning, when God created, he came down into the darkness. In Genesis 1, you can read about it. His spirit there came down and just starts working there and creating everything and pouring himself out in the act of creation. The Hebrew word for create is actually very difficult to translate. It's not really talked about very often, but some suggest that it means to fill or to feed essentially. And so God was filling the creation with himself, a broken and desolate creation that was in a bad condition. Why? Well, that's a whole other we have to do another video for that one because we're running out of time here. But all since the beginning, God comes down. He comes down into the Garden of Eden to have a relationship with Adam and Eve. He comes down and talks to Noah to save Noah from the flood. He comes down and talks to Abraham and talks with Abraham about how he's going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. He has conversations with people. We're just, flesh and blood. And, we're in such a low condition. We're made of the earth, and yet God has a relationship with us. And so, anyway, it's all over the Bible, but culminating, I think, most obviously in the fact that God became a man in Jesus Christ. And so Jesus, God in the flesh, both fully God and fully man, we all agree on that. Those of us who want to be theologically accurate, right? Jesus says this to his disciples. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." Jesus says, "For I am gentle and humble in heart." And then he says, "And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." If this doesn't convince you, I don't know what will. I mean, everything that Jesus did, he lived the perfect life. He didn't have to do that. God didn't have to subject himself to torment and suffering and temptation and all the things that we humans go through. But he did this for us because he is humble. One final consideration. Have you ever wondered why God is invisible? Which I believe, for the most part, there's a way in which he's even invisible in heaven. So kind of like the sun, we see the sun and we see its light, but we can't really look directly at the sun. The Bible talks about God being a God who hides himself. Why would he hide himself, make himself invisible, if he wasn't humble, if he was trying to show off? God's not trying to show off. He's not selfish. He's not boastful or prideful. God is humble. So I hope that's clear to you guys, and I hope that encourages you. That's why we're called to be humble and servants, because that's who he is. Even though, yes, it's all about him, and it's all for his glory.